Hello, hello, hello. Today we're going to talk about, we talked about properties of parallelograms. And today we're going to talk about the properties of squares, rectangles, and rhombuses. And the plural of rhombus is rhombi. So, if you have not done so, please go to quizzes and join and use the code. That is a homework assignment that is due today. Here they are. A picture of a rectangle. Just like we talked about the properties of a parallelogram, in a rectangle, opposite sides are congruent. So you can label that by drawing these fancy little pictures. 2 tick mark sides are congruent to 2 tick mark sides. So when you set up your equation, you're going to set the sides equal to each other. Angles. All angles are 90 degrees. They're all right angles. So we're going to put the little indication there. And diagonals. Something cool about these diagonals is the long diagonals here. Those are congruent. And because the long diagonals are congruent, they're actually bisecting each other. And what do you remember about bisect? Yes, they cut it into equal pieces. So all of that is congruent to each other. So if you're going to set up your equation, you would set them equal to each other. All right, a rhombus. A rhombus is a little different. A rhombus is a special type of parallelogram in that all the sides are the same, but it's a little slanted. So it doesn't make 90-degree angles. But all sides are congruent. And so I can show it with little tick marks. But what's not congruent are all the angles. So this is just like a parallelogram, your opposite angles are congruent. So like this angle is congruent to this angle, and this angle here is congruent to this angle here. So for opposite angles, you would set up the equal sign equation. However, the angles that are next to each other, we call them same side interior angles, equal 180. So you'd set this up, blank plus blank equals 180. Right, diagonals. So the diagonals do bisect each other. But they're not congruent. Oops, what happened there? Not congruent. There's a T there. So that means that you have a long side and you have a short side. So they're not congruent to each other, but you can say that the two bisect each other, so it does cut these pieces evenly. And the other cool thing about the diagonals is that they actually are perpendicular to each other. And what does that mean? That means they make a 90-degree angle. So all 4 of those angles are 90 degrees. Kind of cool property. And the last one is our favorite, the square. All the sides are equal. Bloop, 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 bloop. All angles are 90 degrees. And the diagonals bisect each other. They are perpendicular. And they are congruent. So the square has all the perfect characteristics of a quadrilateral. Like that. So if you were to set up, if you wanted to find a missing side, you'd set it up using this formula. If you wanted to find a missing angle, you just know it's 90 degrees. And if you wanted to find a missing diagonal length, you would just set it up that way. Awesome. Make sure you don't take the rhombus. Okay. Go ahead and let's go ahead and identify which special type of shape each of these are. You might want to have your notes in front of you so that you can identify them along with me. So we're going to skip that next page. When I photocopied, I did it in the wrong order, but you're all good. So this first one I noticed, 90 degrees. I noticed these angles are not 90 degrees, so I can say this is a rhombus. Over here, if I know this side, I know this side. And if I know this side, then I know the side opposite is congruent. And I notice that they're 90-degree angles. So even though it doesn't look like it, because of the way that I labeled my figure, I can say that this is a square. Over here, I know these are all going to be 90-degree angles because of same side interior angles. I have to add up to, these angles here have to add up to 180 degrees. So this is a rectangle. So the other property I know about a rectangle is that opposite sides are going to be congruent. Number 4, if these two sides are congruent, I can say the sides opposite are also congruent. Having said that, the angles are not labeled 90 degrees, so therefore I'm going to label this a rhombus. And I know that the if I were to draw the diagonals in, they would cross at a 90-degree angle. And here we go. So I see that these two diagonals are equal to each other, and they don't cross here at a 90-degree angle, but they're all congruent, so I'm going to say this is a rectangle. And lastly, this beautiful shape, number 6, has all the beautiful characteristics of a square. Knowing this, I can also say that these sides are equal and they're all going to cross at a 90-degree angle. Okay, let's go ahead and go through this checklist together. For this checklist, go ahead and pause the video, and I want you to go back and determine, for example, for which shapes, which quadrilaterals are all the angles congruent? Well, I know a rectangle, all the angles are 90 degrees. In a rhombus, it's not all angles, it's only opposite. So I'm not going to check that one, but in the square, they're all 90 degrees. In which shapes are all the sides congruent? Well, I know a rectangle is opposite sides, so I'm not going to check that one. But I do know that a rhombus and a square, all sides are congruent. Now we're talking about diagonals here. So we're talking about which shape are the diagonals congruent. And again, that's going to be our rectangle and our square. In a rhombus, you're going to have one long and one short. And in a square and a rhombus, our diagonals actually meet at a 90-degree angle. So those are the special characteristics of a rectangle, rhombus, and square. Actually, the rest, all of these, are characteristics of all parallelograms. And please remember, a parallelogram, the definition of a parallelogram is that there's two sets of parallel sides. So this is all parallelograms. So we can just check it all off. They all bisect each other. All diagonals bisect the vertex angles. So what does that mean? That means that the cuts, if you bisect that means this angle and this angle are congruent. Both pairs of opposite sides are congruent. That's all of them. Both pairs of opposite angles are congruent. Any two consecutive angles are supplementary. We call that SSI. And it looks like this angle and this angle. These angles are supplementary. So yes, all three. And diagonals bisect each other. Yes, all three. And that's characteristic for all parallelograms. Okay, so now what I'd like you to do is to review your notes, pause the video, and see if you can label. Here are some pictures. Label what you know on the pictures based on what we learned. So this is a parallelogram. This is a quadrilateral. From a parallelogram, we've got a rectangle and a rhombus. And finally, we can go all the way down to a square. So I want you to label what's congruent on everything. Notice the difference between a quadrilateral and a parallelogram is a parallelogram has two parallel sides. And notice this quadrilateral, this side is not parallel to this side. But in this parallelogram, you have two sides that are parallel. And all the rest of the shapes below the quadrilateral have that situation. All right, pause the video and I'll come back and let you know. Finish this entire page. This is the fancy drawing. And so basically what you can say for certain is that quadrilaterals can be broken up into 4 different categories. Parallelograms, so all parallelograms, rhombuses, rectangles, and squares are quadrilaterals. So parallelograms can then be rhombuses, squares, or rectangles. And a rhombus can then be a square if it looks like this, and a rectangle can be a square if it looks like this. So a square is a rhombus, a rectangle, a parallelogram, and a quadrilateral. A rhombus is only a parallelogram and a quadrilateral, and a rectangle is only a parallelogram and a quadrilateral, and a parallelogram can only be a quadrilateral. So when you're answering the question down here, a square is a rhombus, yes, always. A rectangle is a square, well, sometimes a rectangle is a square, sometimes a rectangle is just a rectangle. A rhombus is a rectangle? Never, because a rhombus never has 90-degree angles. A rhombus is a square? Never, because a rhombus doesn't have 90-degree angles. A parallelogram is a rectangle. Sometimes, but sometimes a parallelogram is just a parallelogram or it's a rhombus. And a square is always a parallelogram. And down here, the best you can classify these is square, rhombus, and parallelogram. All right, go ahead and start. You can complete this on the back of your note sheet, and you can start practicing IXL, N6, and N7. Go ahead and draw this and answer all the questions on the back of your note sheet.